All right, regarding the ICE agent's recent shooting of that woman in Minneapolis, I'm going to provide everybody a solid and give additional detail, depth, and nuance specifically regarding U.S. case law in these types of scenarios. One of the cases is as recent as 2023, so I'll give you my take on a couple of case law scenarios and then my overall take on the incident. And I'm not going to walk back or apologize, but I will concede that it may not be as simple as I made it sound in the first video. And I'm also going to tag Star Sarge, who is still a police officer somewhere up in the Midwest. Now, I sent a text to about 9 of my friends. Most of them are retired police officers. There's 1 or 2 that are still policing. I got feedback from most of them that they agree in general, but one of them told me, and his department has been through a lot of situations with the Department of Justice regarding use of force, he thinks that it might get looked at as an officer-induced scenario. So we're going to specifically look at that in Barnes versus Felix here, 5th Circuit 2024, U.S. Supreme Court. Officer Roberto Felix pulled over a driver for a toll violation. As Barnes began to drive away, Officer Felix did not move out of the way, but instead jumped onto the moving vehicle's door sill and fired 2 shots inside, slaying Barnes. The inducing action is that the officer escalated a nonviolent traffic stop by jumping onto a moving vehicle. The case outcome is that the 5th Circuit initially applied the moment of threat rule, finding that the officer was in danger when he was on the car. However, the Supreme Court reversed this just this year, May of 2025, or last year, rejecting the strict moment of threat doctrine. The ruling dictates that courts must consider the officer's pre-shooting conduct, stepping onto the car, and that may have created the necessity for the use of deadly force. Then we go into County of Los Angeles versus Mendez 2017. We won't get into that much because it's more of a Fourth Amendment violation as far as they didn't have a warrant to go into the shack in the first place, but Mendez will pop up in another case. Gordon versus Biaranga case 2023, an officer shot a driver as he was driving away at slow speeds. The officer claimed he was in fear for his safety. The inducing action is that the officer positioned himself in a way that made the car's movement seem threatening despite the slow speed. Now, the case outcome is that the court denied qualified immunity to the officer, noting that shooting at a moving vehicle to stop a fleeing suspect when the vehicle does not pose an immediate threat can violate Fourth Amendment. Then there's Mullinex versus Luna 2015, which we won't get into much because the officer was actually positioned above, like overhead on an overpass and shot down at a fleeing vehicle, supposedly to disable it by shooting into the engine block, but the officer hit the driver. This one doesn't apply as much to our scenario, I don't think. Now we can discuss this one. I don't think it applies as much. This case in 2010, they decided that the officers acted recklessly, and here's where they came out with provocation doctrine, later refined in the Mendez case that we've already gone over. They stated that if an officer intentionally or recklessly provokes a violent confrontation, basically they can be held liable. It's not a lawful shooting. So here's some key legal theories in vehicle shootings that we've gone over. Moment of threat, totality of circumstances, and officer created or induced jeopardy. Also, we went over provocation. Okay, so now we have some legal historical case law theory and framework. So let's take a look at that video. Go view that video a few more times. Okay, here's my take on it. ICE is conducting lawful law enforcement operations, and there was a gathering of protesters or whatever. They might have been protesting, but at some point the woman in the vehicle seemed to have been trying to actually use her vehicle to physically impede the law enforcement operations. These last 2 parts are key because at a certain point the law enforcement agents stopped their vehicles, got out of their vehicles, and approached her vehicle, and it appears to me as if they're going to try to effect an arrest on her, at which time it appears to me as if she's initially attempting to resist that arrest. And this last point is important too. That officer that was in front of her vehicle that initially parked ahead of her on the other side of the street as he was crossing from her right to her left in front of her vehicle. As he paused there, did he intentionally pause and put himself in jeopardy, inducing that threat? Since this has resulted in the loss of life, the federal government will be conducting a thorough investigation. There will be body camera, video, and audio coming out. There will be all of the testimony of all of the agents versus all of the other witnesses to determine if there was a grave violation of the Constitution. Here's a kicker that might blow you away. The friend I have that's from a department that was under a great deal of Department of Justice scrutiny for previous issues says that per his department, in accordance with Department of Justice scrutiny, might see this as an officer-induced scenario. Now, his department was under a great deal of scrutiny for a variety of previous use of force and excessive force scenarios, many of which they were approaching homeless people, and homeless people literally tried to stab them, and they were still found at fault for excessive use of force. That scenario provided a private individual that has an investigative background and a link to the Department of Justice an opportunity to make millions of dollars reviewing that department's policies and procedures and monitoring them over the course of several years to determine if they were making strides or improvements in their use of force. And the person from a whole other country that made the comment that ICE agents don't need to have firearms needs to stop making stupid comments. As a police officer, former police officer, even if I didn't have a firearm, I was stabbed at twice. Somebody tried to throw a brick at my head once. I was jumped on by a few people who were unarmed, but they were trying to take my firearm. So it took me a while I tried to secure my firearm and fight them off. And the only way I was able to fight them off was with pepper spray and a stick before I withdrew my firearm. At any rate, a nation state is not going to tolerate violence towards its agents because its agents are acting as best they can in accordance with their training. So that has to be determined in this case, but not to confuse the issue with anybody. But I'm going to leave everybody with kind of like a violence spectrum. This isn't the exact chart I'm looking at or looking for, but so everybody knows, regardless of what the group or organization is, non-state actor, whether it's an insurgent group like the groups in the Middle East, a criminal organization like Russian Vor or the Camorra Mafia in Naples, whatever it is, if they are using on this scale here, let's say the non-state actors are this way, if their use and application of force, coercion, and violence and brutality is too excessive, they lose popular support of the people, and the people start siding with the government and law enforcement because there needs to be order before there is liberty. Now, alternatively, if that pendulum swings this way and the government agents are using too much violence, force, or coercion, and it starts tipping this way, then the populace is going to side with the criminal organizations or the insurgent group or whatever and against the nation state. That's not what, of course, this model is best applied to counterinsurgency and counter-extremism and counter-organized crime, but I think it can be reasonably applied in some way towards criminal justice or criminology. But I don't think that's what's going on here, and I think if one wants to side a little bit away from the Trump administration because they don't like Trump and they're siding sort of basically away from anything U.S. government at this point, that is one thing, but one can't actually physically try to obstruct or impede law enforcement actions. And one might argue, hey, that police officer shouldn't have been in front of the vehicle to begin with. That vehicle should not have been positioned in the road like it was in the first place. And it looked to me like the agents were making a reasonable effort to approach her, contact her, and either arrest her or otherwise get her vehicle out of the way so they could just get out of the area. And that's what the people wanted, for them to get out of the area.